Hello everyone, and welcome to General Psychology, Psychology 101, and today we're going to be talking about the brain. Now, the brain is possibly one of the most important organs in the human body, and especially when we think about psychology, it's the most important. It's what controls every action, our thoughts, our feelings, and behaviors. And in terms of psychology, you are your brain. Everything that you do, there's a biological happening inside your brain that corresponds with it. So brain is very important, and even though you may hear this a lot, even though movies may tell you it's true, you are using more than 10% of your brain. You are using all of your brain very efficiently and very effectively, might I add. So we want to know about the brain. How do we study it? We can't just dig in there. We need to figure out some sneaky ways in terms of how do we understand, okay, certain things are happening, we're behaving in certain ways, we're thinking certain things. What's happening in the brain when that's happening? How can we identify what areas of the brain, for example, are activated while certain behaviors are occurring? Well, we have a lot of different techniques that we can use in order to examine the brain. First, this is probably the least ideal situation, especially in terms of human research. We can lesion certain areas of the brain, certain brain clusters, and see how that affects behavior, thought, or feelings. That would be basically destroying certain areas or certain clusters of brain cells and leaving the surrounding area unscathed. In this way we can pinpoint the certain connection between areas of the brain and specific behaviors. This is more commonly used in animal research compared to human research, obviously. Alternatively, we can stimulate certain areas of the brain to see if that leads to specific behaviors, thoughts, or feelings, or experiences. This is done somewhat in human research, at least more often than lesions, and it also is trying to pinpoint certain areas of the brain to see what specific behaviors, specific thoughts, feelings they coincide with. We can use some more, technologically advanced techniques to study the brain. We can use an EEG or an electroencephalogram to read electrical activity across the surface of the brain. And ideally, the areas of the brain that have the most electrical activity also coincides with the areas of the brain that are most active. And then we can kind of correlate that with specific behaviors. We can use a PET or a positron emission tomography scan to show consumption of sugar glucose in specific areas of the brain. This is basically how much fuel is each area of the brain consuming, and then we can pinpoint, again, areas of the brain to specific behaviors. We can use MRI or fMRIs to, in the case of MRI, basically generate an image of the brain to see exactly how it's structured, especially to detect abnormalities in the brain. And with an fMRI, we're examining blood flow, in these areas of the brain. The more blood flow we see, that generally signals more activity in that area of the brain. Now, all of these technologies are examining different aspects of basically brain activity, and they're all very amazing, but all of these techniques have different weaknesses. And it's very important to remember when you're consuming scientific research that simply seeing a picture of a brain with areas of it lit up doesn't mean that you're reading sound science. At best, imaging techniques can reveal neural activity in a region around the time of an event. And honestly, that's pretty good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a one-to-one correlation between brain activity and whatever's being lit up on the whole scan that we have. So it's good to take this research with a grain of salt, but really the technological advances that are occurring in neuropsychology and neurobiology are astounding, and it's only a matter of time until we are able to figure out exactly how to measure activity in specific regions of the brain and how they might coincide with specific thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So let's get into the different structures of the brain. So first we have the brainstem. This is probably the foundation of the brain, one of the older structures of the brain. This is connected directly to the spinal cord, and this consists of two major parts. We have the medulla, which regulates heartbeat and breathing, and the pons, which coordinates specific movements. As we move up the brainstem, we can reach the thalamus. This is basically the brain's sensory switchboard. It connects all the different sensory areas such as sight, hearing, touch, smell, etc., and all locates them here and allows them to either communicate with the brain directly or to move out to other areas of the body. Next, we have the reticular formation. This is basically the nerve network of the brain. It helps enable arousal in different parts of the brain, sending out messages to other areas such as arms, legs, etc., and basically relays all the nerve information that is necessary for communication between the brain and other extremities of the body. And then we have the cerebellum. This literally means little brain, and it has a whole host of different aspects that it controls in the human body, such as nonverbal learning and memory, judgments of time, modulating specific emotions, being able to discriminate different sounds and textures, and coordinating voluntary movement and helping out with balance. So it does a whole lot of things. Again, this is a miniature brain, so to speak, that is located near the bottom of the brain, and to a certain capacity serves a lot of the functions that the main brain does. Next, we have the limbic system. These are different parts of the brain, sections of the brain that are associated with emotions and drives. So we have many different aspects. We have the amygdala, which is associated with feelings of aggression and fear. We have the hypothalamus, which is associated with bodily maintenance. So do I feel hungry? Do I feel thirsty? Do I need to warm myself up, cool myself down? Basically, the different behaviors that we need to survive. The hypothalamus helps us with that. It also is somewhat of a reward center. It makes us feel good after we've accomplished things. And we have the hippocampus, which in Greek actually means seahorse. It looks a little bit like a seahorse as well. And the hippocampus is extremely important for memory. We see a lot of researchers in neurobiology, neuropsychology, who focus on learning and memory. They are specifically studying the hippocampus and different aspects of it. And the last area of the brain we're going to be talking about is the largest. It's the cerebral cortex. And this is the surface layer of the interconnected neural cells of the brain. The cerebral cortex covers both hemispheres of the brain, but the cerebral cortex has ultimate control over all of the information in the information processing center of the brain. But within the cerebral cortex, we have 4 separate lobes in each hemisphere. These lobes are separated by little folds in the brain. So when you see a picture of the brain, you see the little lines. Those are the folds, or otherwise known as fissures. And each of these different lobes has different functions. The frontal lobe, this is the lobe located near the front of the brain, is also known as the motor cortex. This controls bodily movements and other movements for the opposite side of the body. So the frontal lobe on our right hemisphere controls bodily movements of our left side of the body. Also has an influence on speaking, making plans, and judgments. The parietal lobe is our sensory cortex. This is located towards the upper back part of our brain. This organizes and sends out sensory input for touch and other body position aspects. The occipital lobe, again, is near the very back of the brain. This is the visual cortex. This is the smallest lobe of the 4 lobes and organizes visual sensory information and input. And the temporal lobe, which is located kind of towards the back and side of the brain, is the auditory cortex. It receives and sends out information from our ears for our hearing senses. And it is associated with the opposite ear. So our right temporal lobe is associated with our left ear. One really interesting thing about the cerebral cortex is that if we think about what the frontal lobe does in terms of controlling movements for the opposite side of the body, there's some technology out there that allows people to use this lobe to control things other than their body by connecting specific areas of the frontal lobe to, for example, computer interfaces. People who have lost control of their body, people who are paralyzed maybe from the neck down, are able to, using their brain, control mouse cursors, artificial limbs, video game controllers, for example. Other than the lobes, there are other areas of the brain known as association areas that help interconnect these lobes and also help out with higher mental functions such as learning, remembering, thinking, speaking, also mathematical and spatial reasoning. Other areas such as the fusiform face area, or FFA, is a specific region of the brain that helps us recognize faces and sees faces in things that are not human. So if you've ever seen a drawing of a house, sometimes it may look like a face just because we're programmed to recognize faces in objects. And these association areas are really interesting because they can't necessarily be neatly mapped onto the brain. again, we don't use 10% of our brain, we use our entire brain, and our brain is really able to adapt to who we are as a person and possible environmental issues or environmental impacts that have occurred on our brain. So, for example, the fusiform face area is generally in 2 specific areas, but can move around depending on the individual, depending on if it's adaptive for them to be in different areas. And this leads us to talk about what's known as plasticity. We see that, especially with individuals who have severe amounts of brain damage, so the best example of this is a man by the name of Phineas Gage, had a railroad spike driven through his skull, yet was able to survive and was basically able to perform all the everyday tasks that he would otherwise perform, even though he was missing a large portion of his brain. So his brain was able to adapt, move some of these, basically relocate specific areas of the brain to different regions, so that way the tasks that should have been done by the areas of his brain that were missing are now in other areas that still exist and are able to perform these tasks. One interesting thing about Phineas Gage is that he had massive frontal lobe damage, and through this example, researchers were able to determine that the frontal lobe has strong correlations to developing personality. Specifically, the more frontal lobe you have, the more inhibited you are. So, for example, of Phineas here, he had massive frontal lobe damage, so he went from a more affable, soft-spoken person to a more irritable, profane, and dishonest person. But with brain plasticity, again, brains are sculpted by our genetics and our experiences, and brains can modify themselves after damage. So a great example of this is sometimes you'll see blind or deaf people repurpose those areas of the brain that they don't need anymore to maybe heighten other senses. This is the kind of impetus for the superhero Daredevil, a blind man who can hear everything extremely well. And we see that the brain is able to form new neurons as under a certain age, and this is what's known as neurogenesis, or a form of self-repair by the brain. Another way that the brain is able to adapt to the environment is through the fact that it has 2 separate hemispheres that, for the most part, do very similar things, but they do have very specific tasks that are best suited to each specific hemisphere. So, for example, the right side of the brain is more adept to perceptual tasks, making inferences and having a sense of self, whereas the left brain is more adept to speech and calculations. And this is known as lateralization, basically having specific skills or tasks more appropriate for each of the 2 hemispheres. And there's a part of the brain known as the corpus callosum that connects these 2 together. This is basically a thick bundle of axons that are able to connect each of these hemispheres together. Sometimes you'll see situations in which the brain is split, in which for some reason maybe certain disorders, certain psychological disorders are preventing an individual from having a normal life. And the only solution is to actually separate the 2 hemispheres of the brain, to cut or sever the corpus callosum. We see that for the most part people remain relatively normal, but we see that the 2 hemispheres can no longer communicate with each other, which sets up some really interesting situations where people can, in some way, shape, or form, have 2 separate minds, where each hemisphere might be seeing and feeling completely different things, and it can be very confusing for the individual. So that's all I have today. Thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you next time. Thanks.